So let's begin. Once again, good afternoon, everybody. You have joined the presentation of the first analytical report, Belarusian Change Tracker, and this presentation is supported by Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung and Belarusian Press Club. I'm Natalia Ganzievska. I represent the Belarusian Press Club, and I will be moderating this meeting today. Belarus is going through the very turbulent period in its history: war in Ukraine, political crisis, mass repression, sanctions, international isolation. All of that poses many new challenges for the researchers. 6 Belarusian experts in political sciences, economy, and sociology will try and determine sustainable and more or less long-term trends, and once every 3 months we'll generate an analytical report, which will be called Belarusian Change Tracker. And today the experts present their first report. So here are the board of experts: Pavel Slunkin, associated analyst in the European Council on International Relations. Pavel, hello. Thank you. And Artyom Shraibman, founder of Sense Analytics Center. Philipp Bikanau, independent sociologist. Hello, Philip. Henadz Korshunau, senior analyst in the Center New Ideas. Hello. Kateryna Bornukova, academic director, BEROC, and invited professor of Karl III University in Madrid. And Lev Lvovskiy, senior analyst at BEROC. Also, with a word of greeting, we'd like to hear Friedrich-Ebert, representative of Belarus, Christopher. Hello, Christopher.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I'll wait a second so people can switch with the
And before I pass the floor to speakers, here's the agenda. First, the experts' presentations, then Q&A. So if you, during the presentation, there will be questions or comments emerging, please put them in the chat and we will read them and discuss them. Now I'll pass the floor to a representative of Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, Christopher Forrest. Christopher Forrest, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So thank you. Welcome everyone to this launch of the very first edition of the Belarus Change Tracker. I hope many more editions to follow. When 6 of the best Belarusian analysts approached us with the common idea for a new analytical flagship project, it was a no-brainer for us as Friedrich-Ebert Foundation Belarus to agree to supporting this. Friedrich-Ebert Foundation is Germany's oldest political foundation, and we're striving to support the values of social democracy, such as democratic rights, justice and freedom, and put a particular emphasis on peace and security in Europe and beyond. And we have been supporting such research projects for many years and in many countries around the globe. We believe that profound analyses are the first step towards necessary political reforms, especially if they are as profound as today's holistic product. Artyom, Pavel, Kateryna, Lev, Philipp, and Henadz combine the best of all worlds. They bring in expertise as political analysts, as economists, as sociologists, and our project unites all of their strengths. But what's more is that it does something very unusual actually for these times. It takes a bit of a slower approach compared to the day-to-day crisis mode kind of analyses we are unfortunately and for understandable reasons used to in Belarus since 9th August 2020. This project is called Change Tracker for a reason, since it actually aims at tracking changes over time, which makes its very first edition, which we're launching today, so particularly important since it lays the foundation for everything yet to come. Would we have done this since 2020, there would have been so many things to notice and draw conclusions from actually. The number of sudden events in Belarusian modern history is truly impressive, albeit usually in a negative meaning. Violence, obviously, after the fraudulent 2020 elections, the mass arrests and the exodus of activists, story of Roman Pratasevich and a certain Ryanair flight, the migration crisis, Belarusian politics in the focus at the Olympics, obviously many stories of political prisoners in Belarus, but also more and more sanctions, more and more dependence on Russia, an ever-growing alienation of different segments of the society, and of course, and now above everything, Russia's deadly war in Ukraine and the role Belarus plays in it. so much has happened since August 2020, and so often we've been busy with ad hoc analyses and felt like we are in crisis mode. Now the experts are still going to analyze new events, but by doing this on a regular basis in a set format, they're also drawing comparisons and in a way slowing down things a bit to go a bit deeper into the issues. And what's more, they're going to have fresh data with every edition of our change tracker, as a sociological survey is a cornerstone of this project. The combination of a regular sociological survey and a deep analysis by 6 renowned experts makes this project what it is, and hopefully our change tracker will be unique and a useful tool. We are happy to support today's launch as well as the entire first edition of the Belarus Change Tracker. I can already say it's not going to be the last, and I hope you will find today's launch, as I said, useful, and also the change tracker itself and its subsequent editions. I want to thank our experts once again, as well as my colleagues who have been working on this project despite being directly affected by the terrible war in Ukraine, as our office continues to be based in Kiev and most of my colleagues continue to work from Ukraine. Currently, there are air raid alarms again. We all hope for peace and for Belarus foreign policy to not cross yet another line and open another phase of crisis mode work, which could even be more disastrous than all we have seen already. But I'm sure this thought will also be part of what our experts are covering in the Belarus Change Tracker, and therefore today's discussion will circle around. Thank you, and now over to our experts.
Thank you, Christopher. And now I would like to pass the floor to Artyom Shraibman, co-initiator and co-author of the report. Artyom, could you tell us, please, about the idea of this report, its structure, and why is it unique? I hope you can hear me. Hello, everyone. Thank you for getting here on Zoom or YouTube. Sorry for possible technical glitches because we are making this hybrid presentation for the first time. And I'm going to just tell you a short version how this idea came about, why it came about. We are all involved in this information noise, which is where it's very difficult to, pull away from these current events, this second, this minute. They often don't signify any sustainable trends, so you can't see them. In order to see them in this whirlwind of storm, we decided to publish these documents of many pages, but there's different reports. We do it quarterly. We think it's an optimal regularity so that our conclusions are relevant. Secondly, so that they are removed enough from everyday info bombs that we get attacked on a daily basis. And that's why our style of work, our approaches to analysis of events in 3 topics, politics, economy, and sociology, as we think it will create more added value and will be even more valuable as we aggregate these reports, because we will record trends in the dynamic. Which of them continue, which of them discontinue or wane. Our team is 6 people who, as we've said already, we initiated the project when we were all in Ukraine, and that's how we got together to discuss this idea. But then the war has thrown us all over the Europe. So we hope that we will manage at some point to get us all into one audience to have an offline presentation with the broadcast. But at the moment, we have to be partially remote, but that doesn't have much impact on the quality of our work, in the sense that I believe it's a very unique product. It's unique enough because on this market of analytical offers, there is a lot of operational analytics. There are many comments. There's a lot of analytics of a long-term horizon. There's a Belarusian annual publication for more than 10 years. It exists, and it does similar work. But the punchline is the survey. This is Philipp Bikanau, who's going to speak a little later. That's who's responsible. So because of all limitations that Belarus has now, we do everything online, but with all the possible, with respecting all criteria of effectiveness and performance. But of course, it covers Belarusians who live in cities and have internet. I won't take much of your time in the introduction. I pass the floor to a moderator, so that Natalia passed it back to us with Pavel, and we will present our points in a very short, concise form, 5 minutes for each, other than Philip. Philip has a special role in this, and we will present them first as a monologue, and then we'll answer your questions. Thank you, Natalia. And as Artyom said, our expert, Pavel Slunkin, associated analyst of the EU and international relations. Pavel, Artyom, please, the floor is yours. Hello, Natalia. Good afternoon. Greetings, everybody.
Recording in progress.
So I'm going to start by saying why, or what was the starting point for this report. Artyom gave you a little bit of info on what we're doing, but this is important to know that the starting point, as you could have guessed, was the Russian invasion into Ukraine in February 2022. So this armed invasion, from our point of view, has become one of the key events in the modern history of Belarus, which will determine the trajectory of our country's development for the next decades. The depth of dependence that the Belarusian regime has put itself from Russia after 2020, it didn't allow the Belarusian authorities to once again use this regional crisis for foreign political balancing act, like the Belarusian authorities did in 2014. And Belarus has found itself in a completely new military political reality where previous models of foreign policy don't work. The policies that used to work, used to be effective, they are less and less relevant. You could see this after the internal political crisis of 2020, and then became even more apparent in 2022. If earlier Belarusian authorities in their dialogue with the West were trying to use two groups of arguments that had an impact on the dynamic of these relations and allowed to demonstrate an interest to development of relations with the West. And in this group, there were two main arguments. First, proactive steps towards what EU wanted, like releasing political prisoners, softening repressions, harmonization of legislation, lessening the dependence from Russia, foreign activity like Eastern Partnership. The second block was resorting from steps that could further deteriorate or degrade these relations. So retaining the positive status quo. And here is an example. It's like unwillingness to recognize annexation of Crimea, Southern Ossetia, Abkhazia, where Russian military basically. Now, these positive trends have basically been cut down to a group of arguments of the old bloc. Belarusian authorities have tried to use the arguments from the first part this time around, and they tried to sell to the West different negotiation rounds between Russia and Ukraine that happened in Belarus, and this rhetoric of peace, appeasing or peace settlement, it's not usable anymore because they don't buy it there. At the same time, Belarusian authorities are not ready to take internal steps that would be seen in the West as a clear indication of productive dialogue. And therefore, in these conditions, Belarusian authorities have nothing else to do other than use for their foreign policies the arguments of the second bloc. So they are threatening basically to the West. And that's why Minsk, it's easier to, to make the regional security situation even more difficult. Like placement of Russian arms, including the nuclear weapons. That is to prove the conclusion that we did before. You can quote from the recent meeting of Lukashenko and Putin to join Russian troops in Ukraine, to recognize occupation administration in occupied territories of Ukraine, and in the human rights internally, to expand capital punishment of political opponents. And as political authorities thinking, this prospect has to stimulate the West to softening their demands, and they should do the steps. And the Lukashenko's regime itself is not very much interested in escalation, because all these steps that I mentioned, they will lead to negative impact for Belarusian authorities themselves. But if we say about internal domestic economic trends that had impact on the foreign policy, then economic sanctions that were introduced against Belarus after the start of aggression, they exceeded the previous EU and the US sanctions before. Sanctions that we've seen before the Russian invasion. But despite the expectations of many Western policies, this international isolation and this pressure did not force Lukashenko to stop this repression practice and hybrid aggression against the EU and its allies. By choosing between the unpromising attempts to restore the dialogue with the West and trading the loyalty and sovereignty of Belarus for the help from Russia, Lukashenko is betting on Russia. He is a deeply Soviet person, so I believe he tries to restore those economic practices of the USSR in bilateral relations with Russia. In many senses, this option is now the only available option, if we don't count liberalization, democratization. In the long-term horizon, this policy of de-sovereignization of Belarus will lead to Belarus remaining independent state, but in the long-term horizon is only formally. But the key foreign and domestic decisions will be made by Russia, by Moscow. And this hope to turn to Asia, it didn't work at the moment. So toxic Belarusians are isolated from the international and Western markets. It's not attractive. Other than Africa, because they risk to get secondary sanctions. And the proof of that is that after the start of the war, over this period, Vladimir Makеев only had 2 telephone calls with colleagues from Pakistan and Vietnam. So that's all the successes that we can present on this turn. But here I would also say that we often, when we talk about toxicity, increased toxicity of Belarus authorities, the benefits from adding to the aggression are also felt. So clear differentiation for the people and the regime that emerged after 2020 in international agenda. Suddenly, after the start of the invasion, it disappeared. Belarus people suddenly, out of the hopes for Western democracy, have become again aggressors. And any citizen with Belarus passport is a victim of the deeds that of Belarus authorities. And that led to disenfranchisement among the Belarus liberals. They see it as betrayal of the West in trying to break the regime. The shields in Ukraine, refusal to give visas to Belarus citizens, and the problems of political refugees from Belarus that found themselves in Ukraine after the start of this political crisis in Belarus, and they are in Ukraine now, but they are under the hit. And the war strengthened Lukashenko as the only one decision maker in the Belarus. And it added arguments to the advocates of realpolitik. Emmanuel Macron called Lukashenko on the issue of Belarus army joining the war and providing platform, not to Tikhanovsky. Guterres also didn't call Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, but called Lukashenko. So Lukashenko became, at the same time, more toxic, and the regime has become more toxic because of this co-aggressor status. But at the same time, considering the increased risks and the stakes so high, they, in order to resolve their practical gains, they talk to him. And fourth, and this is where I will stop, due to the international community's attention is now on the horrors of the war in Ukraine and helping Kiev to battle with Russian aggression. At the same time, in Belarus, the same things continue to happen. The number of political prisoners starts growing by 20% from the start of war, military aggression, and will continue to deteriorate. At the same time, there's much less attention of the world to these problems. Just 1 minute more in my intervention, because we took it as a condition to analyze not only the factual acts of Belarus authorities, but also about democratic forces. And this is where some of the trends, like Svetlana Tikhanovskaya's office, had to focus on consulate, humanitarian problems, talking to Western policies, and also the efforts of democratic forces and political officers had managed to soften the negative consequences for Belarus citizens who live in the European countries, and Belarus as well. Many countries stopped their previous plans to limit the visas. Tikhanovskaya's team tried to transform her previous image of democratic forces leader to the national leader, transition of the cabinet, which is now the national organ of the Belarus, but practically nobody feels it. They will become more relevant if Lukashenko and his regime will agree to formally approve sovereignty of Belarus and denial of independence. So that's where the alternative authority is important. And now Kiev, which is the second after Vilnius, Tikhanovskaya's office tries to build constructive cooperation between Belarus and Ukraine, which basically pursue the same interests now. But at the same time, the parties face a huge number of problems. These attempts to facilitate dialogue that have to bring closer these two actors who basically have one enemy and they're allies against that enemy. Okay, Pavel and Artyom, thank you very much. And now we'll pass the floor to Kateryna Bornukova, academic director of an invited professor of the Carl III University in Madrid. Kateryna, the floor is yours. Wait, I will intersect because I haven't presented my part. Because as you understand, we've split the topics quite easily. Political bloc is where Pavel has described internal policy, and I'm going to talk about, Pavel talks about foreign policy, and I'm going to talk about internal. Periodization of our report matches the seasons of the year. Now we talk about spring trends, but because the war in Ukraine started in winter, we decided to expand a little bit this period of coverage in the first report. And so for my part, for the domestic policy, it has principal importance because by the end of the winter, we had a referendum, which you probably forgot. But it was a very important thing, that the referendum itself, which would, in a different time, would be a very interesting electoral campaign. But this time, it did not break the trend of depoliticization of Belarusian society. The design of campaign so it reflected they have no bulletin, repressions impacted observers on the previous days of referendum at the end of 2021 were arrested. Mass apathy, lack of faith that this electoral campaign can change anything. That was what Chatham House recorded after the referendum. So as a result, based on this same report, Chatham House, that they conducted over a month after the referendum, turns out referendum most probably has not happened, did not take place. Just a little more than half Belarus people came to it, but that means that according to Belarus laws that none of the options took more than half of the list of the ballot. But it's also obvious from the campaign itself, these two crosses that consolidated Belarus opposition, it also is clear that this campaign also hasn't reached the result. The attendance, the participation was not as massive as the opposition counted, or at least much less people than expected sent forward their bulletins into Golov Telegram. But this depolitization trend has been broken during the campaign, the constitutional referendum. It was broken by war itself. War, of course, is the background that determines all of our 6 pillars of our report, or the increase or the decrease of these trends. So this politicization was an outbreak of protests on February 27, which continued for some days, but it also was more of a guerrilla activity of a civil society, and sometimes forceful opposition. This is where Gennady will talk a little bit about the civil society, who's responsible for civil society in the topical breakout. What are the lessons of this trend, of this partial politicization? It shows that protest potential is still there, but how to activate it, it's always a question. How strong is the irritant that can irritate people so high that they start acting in reality? So politicization of the outrage of Belarus people in participation in the war, democratic forces have used that. Svetlana Tikhanovskaya declared that she creates her cabinet. She takes the responsibility of national leader, ready to join volunteer battalions to create hindrances for military echelons. She rallied to protest, and they took place in that date and that time in the ballot, during the ballot, by-poll initiative, which cooperates with democratic forces and is their part, you can even say. For the first time, they actively started to direct action, sabotage, and railway guerrilla warfare, basically. So out of these rallies, out of these actions, we see that mobilization rallies to motivate people on earth, they have worked before they hit the wall of repression. But political, they still remain declarational. Like the cabinet has still not been created as announced. Besides, we can see the continuation of another slow trend of democratic forces in Belarus. It's a shaping of a second echelon, the forces of a second echelon. I'm talking about the Forum of Democratic Forces in Warsaw, which is about to happen and the second iteration at Berlin. So the agenda of these forces are intolerable to Lukashenko, but what unites them is dissatisfaction with the opposition as embodied by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. So the first attempt from the office and other mainstream democratic forces of the second echelon to emerge, that was the strike, unsuccessful strike at the end of the previous year. But now there's an attempt of institutionalization of these strikes. There's a structure, a forum, work groups in this forum. If you monitor this, this process is now managed by Valery Tsepkalo, Yuri Kotov, Dmitry Volkunets. They've become the personalia of this process. Then we go to, I will wrap my part of, so the response of the authorities, which is also an internal domestic political actor. Well, it is, of course, the mobilization causes the wave of repressions, arrests, and fines that human rights activists have recorded in March, right after the protests. This time, just as previous times, as the repressions go, they were accompanied with physical violence to the detainees at the end of February, as demonstration by acts of violence, shooting these railway guerrilla warriors, unprecedented capital punishment and reintroduction for thinking about terrorism, plus the local trend of more intense repressions. So the general repression track has continued, cleansing the third sector. In this sector, it's also lawyers community, trade unions, drafting the law on civil society, which the authorities is trying to regulate more actively, offline or out of court hearings. And in June, this law was passed in second reading. What was new? What are the sub-trends that we can see in this whole tightening the bolts after the February? It's more active pro-government activists to pressure the opponents. A small pool of activists, several dozen people. The most prominent of them are the TV stars, TV propaganda in Belarus. Some politicians, like the MPs, like Oleg Yanukovych, Belarusian, who are now actively engaged in being in embassies to pressure the guests, initiation of reparations through attending the exhibitions that are about to shut down, the shops that are about to shut down, etc., etc. And another slow-burning trend is some sort of competition between the law enforcers. As we've known from one of the meeting of Lukashenko with the enforcers, there was a competition between the general prosecutor and other repression agencies. The investigative committee, where General Prosecutor Shved just stood up and said that he believes that other agencies are too passive, and Lukashenko agreed with him. The Ministry of Internal was criticized. After that, repression intensified in all the areas. So that wraps my presentation. Thank you. And I pass the floor to economic part. Okay, and now Kateryna Bornukova has the floor. Thank you, Natalia. Thank you, everybody. Everything that happened in the foreign economic relations in spring, it was mostly moved by political relations, and primarily participation of Belarus in aggression against Ukraine. And the main trend here is almost complete disruption of economic relations with the West. The West is EU and the US and other countries combined, like Japan, Taiwan, who are also who also introduced sanctions against Belarus. As for the sanctions themselves, what was introduced, what was implemented, starting from February, when Lithuania, in fact, closed the transit of Belarus sodium, and sanctions in March, April, and May by EU. Those have become the sanctions that basically completely different from what we've seen before. Before we've seen sanctions with the protracted action, with the postponed effect, with some exclusions. There were some warning shots. Now these sanctions are no warning shots anymore, because European sanctions cover main exports for Belarus goods that used to be exported in that area, and they cover 70% of exports to EU. For Belarus, it's a big hit because it's a small open economy that exported a lot and imported quite a lot as well. Other than sanctions, what is within this trend of a disruption of relations? Other than export sanctions, there are also financial sanctions that are making any foreign economic relations very difficult with any countries. We can also hear that India cannot pay us because the money is blocked on Sberbank accounts who used to operate these payments. And a lot as a transit country. And besides, other than sanctions, consequences, the outflow of IT specialists of toxicity in the first place. And that is made, also Belarus has lost another trade partner, Ukraine, in March, zero.
Тем не менее, санкции, как сказала Екатерина, были отложенного характера.
The sanctions previously were postponed long term. Plus, we were lucky with the world situation in 2021. It continued to grow. With the start of the war, the new trend started. In February, the war had not touched Belarus economy. Decline. All the spheres of economy are in decline. What's growing is information and connectivity, which is IT. But a long-term trend, the spheres of economy are in decline, and IT growth. What's growing is because information, the problems and with IT connectivity, which is IT. But a long-term trend, the spheres of economy are in decline. The outflow of the brain drain. But the basic growth in this area is so big that even with these challenges, we still continue to see growth for some time. Nominal revenues of the population are stagnating, slightly growing, but real profits are in decline for several months now because of the growing inflation rate. Inflation is now higher than 18% annual, with the target indicator of the National Bank 5%. So more than triple. The second trend is, we call it concealment of information. And, building this beneficial picture, a good picture. Well, Belarus has always had this trend, but from the start of the war, it's reborn and gained volume. So this trend comes from the concept of managing economic expectations. As I said, it's nothing new. It's been discussed for a while in the highest cabinets and in these behind the scenes of the economic bloc. And even with the less favorable objective background, you can still create favorable expectations of economic agents. If you look at the interviews of official representatives of the economic bloc, we can see only positive things. They pick and choose positive facts and state them. And they usually don't say a word about GDP decline, salaries decline in some areas, in some industries, like in our biggest sodium region. The real revenues have been down by 40% in April. Plus, closing the official information sources, several articles on export statistics have been redacted. Like Kateryna's data on physical volumes, we still receive them, but on the general exports, starting from April, we don't see them anymore. The third trend, not sodium, potassium. So the third trend is statism of economy. It started growing back from political crisis of 2005. Now we see even more steps in this area. The attempts of stringent control over prices, which doesn't result in anything, and because they cannot stop inflation. Out of new trends, we see more stringent regulation and attacks on the banking sphere. And if we see the number of bankers, candidates to the managing councils of the banks who suddenly turns out are not enough qualified. And these percentages, these numbers have grown several times over the last 2 years. In 2022, this number also breaks all the records. Another axis of statism is state investments. We've seen a lot of declarations about the new state investment cycle. They create a big apparatus around development banks, where all the free money is redirected to. Development banks, National Bank of Belarus have allowed to issue their bonds worth of several billion rubles. They've attempted quite the dangerous economic scheme that money that are intended for insurance of deposits of commercial banks have also been redirected to the bonds of development bank. And finally, all these verbal interventions. And the most prominent is Lukashenko's intervention, where he told to IT people how the industry should develop, how they should build products for Belarus, not work for the Western companies and Western market. And the latest trend, most unexpected, is local spot on liberalization. With all the stringent controls and pressure, people in the economy, always during the time of crisis, they count for some liberalization. At the very start of the war, we also heard different offers and calls for help from official and unofficial leaders in Belarus. So Republican Union of Industry, they designed a document where they suggested a lot of measures that should help businesses. The Republican Confederation of Entrepreneurs suggested, they asked for the Union state to allocate 1.2 trillion Russian rubles to help businesses. Most of these suggestions were not taken by the government. Ministry of Finance even said that the money that the state has, we need them for agriculture, for the new sowing campaign, not the IT business. But we've still seen some liberalization. There was a 5-fold increase of the goods that no longer need to pay fees. There is no more food embargo that Belarus earlier introduced to respond against European sanctions. And also a big textual document, but small in real assistance, the package of state measures to simplify, to lighten the situation in the economy. The problem with this package is that these measures exist only on paper. A similar package of measures we've seen before, where COVID crisis was in Belarus. And at that time, the utilization of these measures of state assistance was minimal. That's why we must expect that even now, the entrepreneurs will hardly beg money from the state for their ideas. That was my intervention. Thank you. Thank you. And Philipp, independent sociologist, has the floor. Thank you, Natalia. Colleagues. I prepared some slides for the audience. Because I have results of our survey, exclusive survey, other than ruminations, other surveys, and the interpretation. I'm trying to share my screen now. Lera Klimenko from the foundation must be mentioned, an honorable mention. She helped us prepare this.
Говори ближе к микрофону.
Please speak closer to the microphone. We can barely hear you.
Что-то произошло не так. А если вот так? Стало лучше. Я прошу прощения.
Sorry.
Вот. Технические накладочки сбили меня с ритма с этим микрофоном. Но сейчас пошарим.
I finally fixed the microphone. So, once again, we see three effects, important trends, basically. We're going to talk about the season from the start of the war, Russian aggression against Ukraine. So the main external factor that impacted public opinion is, of course, war. We will dwell on the data from the surveys that we did in May 2022. We will compare it with the survey of 2021, the same methodology, and we'll refer to surveys conducted by our colleagues since the start of the war. So what has changed in Belarus society? So we're talking about social conflicts. We have several groups of population that are in the clash. Classification 103, the kernel of the protest, the bastion of Lukashenko, and the neutral part. In my classification, it's going to be 2 or 4. And we see the society through the prism of the social conflicts and trying to explain the dynamics of what we're seeing. There will be 3 main points. First, the flag effect among the neutral subjects, the growing radicalization among the polar segments of society, who clearly understand who's the enemy, who's not, and how the war impacted this radicalization, how it became part of the structure of social conflict. So first of all, the dynamics. Trust to government and institutions have grown. Why? Because the clusterization tool that splits the population in parts is agreement with the declarations of trust towards certain groups or institutions, state or non-state institutions, who basically are recognized as supporting or being part of the governmental power or in opposition to the regime. So based on these responses, we see 4 groups. Stolid advocates of the regime who are trusting strongly to all the governmental institutions, militia, people who then they support Lukashenko and his regime. Now, opponents who, on the contrary, distrust the government institutions and they trust more to those who, in their opinion, in opposition to government, independent media, or talking about people, the political prisoners, for instance. Among them, or between them, there are small groups. They lean toward trust or lean toward distrust. So they are on the fence. And we see that both groups that lean towards trust or lean towards distrust, they also have an impact on this dynamic. Why we split it into four? That we did it consciously because we've seen the results, like a serious transformation. We started thinking, what happened? Are there any external factors that impact this? The fear effect or something else maybe. And our survey, which we did on online panel, first online panel 1,000 people and another panel 500, to measure, to exclude the hypothesis that we cannot trust our data because we would have some technical problems. What we've seen finally, we've seen the dynamic, a very similar dynamic, but the sizes of these groups inside, like more advocates of government, more distrustful, and more in-betweens. So this is where we see small groups having a dynamic where we need to describe what's inside. Instead of saying there were X people before, and now there's epsilon. How it come to this? Let's see. We've used a tool by Levada Center, Index of Social Moods. It shows general assessment of the world where an individual lives and tries to digitize it by 13 different questions. In the full report, there is a reference to the methodology. You can read it. But it's important to understand the most important. The index of the family is the personal wealth and morale, material and morale. And then the indices of well-being in the country, expectations, and the government. These three sub-indices are more related to the country itself, the context that the respondent lives in. And we see that personal well-being is an index that is dropping, in decline. But situation assessment is increased in the context. Why it's happening? If we see the distribution of these indices by segments that we've heard before, we see an interesting thing. There are these two big groups, those who are completely on the governmental side and leaning toward trust. For them, the family index is lower than the country indexes. The government index is very high. That is a separate topic. That means, do they agree with what Lukashenko and the government doing? It is a little bit distorted. It's not distorted, but there's a little dirt there. But that's a separate conversation. All the country-related indices, they're higher. And then the second groups, those who distrust or lean towards distrust, their assessment is higher than the situation in the country. And so this phenomenon can be explained by the picture of the future, the vision of the future that Lukashenko is painting for Belarus people. Getting into war will lead to catastrophe for Belarus people and Belarus itself. He says that they're trying to drag Belarus into this. So these pictures of a terrible future, they work to create this kind of alternative, even worse universe than the universe people are living right now. So our well-being in general is so-so, but it could have been much worse. And these people assess their well-being at a higher level. So, but it all could be much worse, they say. And because of this, it could have been much worse. That explains the dynamic. And our colleagues from Chatham House record the attitude of Belarus people towards the war. Because the dynamic of increased trust towards government, towards authority, it describes, we believe, or is explained by the fact that Belarus is still not directly saying either in the war or not. People don't want, like Chatham House says, and Andrei Erdomasov, 11% supports that. I couldn't find these slides to quickly add. Around half would agree that they are really concerned that Belarus will be dragged, and 25% have no concern at all. It's a very serious thing. People are afraid to get into this war full time. Chatham House also has what economically they are afraid of: social stress, economic stress. It's a very painful topic. So that's why when Alexander Lukashenko sells his rhetoric that the country is fighting against being dragged into the war, this falls into a fertilized soil. That's why we talk about flag effects. The flag effect works for neutral segments, and it's the effect of Belarus metaphor, Belarus flag. People are grouping around the idea that you have to, well, do anything to not to allow to be dragged into the war. It's not getting around the idea of supporting the Slavic brother nation fighting some mythical Nazis in Ukraine. This is in great trust. Like the authorities have successfully helped us not to be dragged into war. But in this slide, we see that people in general don't fully understand that Belarus is already been dragged into this war. Not yet full-fledged, but we are in it. We gave the platform, the territory. The missiles hit Ukraine from our territory. Our country is co-aggressor now. And my colleagues who deal with foreign policy and domestic policy, I think they agree with me if I say that being a co-aggressor doesn't help much in terms of our country's status. But people in general do not all of them believe that. There's a high percentage of those who believe that Belarus is not participating in war. There's a high percentage that don't understand. There's less than a half say that Belarus plays on the Russia side. That was in March 2022. Very little foundation to think that the number has changed significantly now. Because from that moment, Belarus territories have started to be used less frequently. Less than a quarter agree that Belarus is an aggressor country. So there's no clear understanding that Belarus is already in the war. And the rhetoric that says we need to refrain from war, it works to increase the trust somewhat. Trust towards the regime, who is trying and doing its best not to be dragged in, but failing miserably. So other than neutral segments, there are also polar segments who are attractors that the neutral segments are attracted to. And here we can talk about strengthening of polarization, radicalization, where war and identities in the war, loyalty in the war, like a person who supports Russia, or a person who supports what Russia does in Ukraine, or a counter-supporter. So this kind of loyalty in this existing equation of a social conflict, they've been put there very easily. They become part of the equation. And these big groups of radical opposition and radical pro-authorities. So those who are against war in Ukraine are against Lukashenko. Well, the second group, those who are for Lukashenko, they support what Russia and Lukashenko are doing in Ukraine. So we use the social distancing scale, our favorite. It's a 7-point scale, where 1 would see among their family, and 7 would not even tolerate them in their country. So these pro-authorities, they don't like their vis-a-vis, and vice versa. They hate each other. Polarization reaches a boiling point, a very serious point, I would say. Alarming. So it's a very unsafe point. There are all the reasons for this kind of clash to go into kinetic violence, because intolerance is already past. As I write it in the report, but a forceful bloc may emerge, like protests, units, militarized units in Belarus, who fight against the regime or fight in Ukraine, gain experience. So in some time perspective situation where these people go to Belarus again and become the kinetic factor against Lukashenko, this is quite an explosive situation. So that wraps my part of the presentation. Thank you, and I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you, Philip. And now, Henadz Korshunau, our presenter, senior analyst from New Ideas Center. Henadz, the floor is yours. Greetings, colleagues, everybody who's watching us. Thanks to our partners. My presentation will be dedicated to how Belarus civil society has been acting in this period. We have to understand several key things. Belarus civil society is not only those who are in Belarus itself. Belarus civil society is much wider now and practically is present on all countries of Europe and all continents on one hand, and secondly, civil society is not just structures, but there's also people. It's a self-organized platform. It's outside institutional field, which is very important as well. So I would like to start by mentioning what was before, what came before the war. Before the war, basically for over 2021, all of the legally approved space was cleansed, was purged. The majority of independent media for regional, the national, was either destroyed or pushed abroad. About 500 NGOs, children's hospices, human rights were liquidated. Dozen thousands went through prisons, and only political prisoners, only more than 1,500. Well, for different reasons. So you could see like full dissipation of civil activity in Belarus. But as Artyom mentioned, the combination of referendum and start of the war in Ukraine gave a big push to renew the protests, pro-political, anti-political activity that coincided. The main driving force of this wave, just like in 2020, is the grassroots self-organizing. This time around, with no institutional support in Belarus itself. So that's why this reformatting happened. People from large-scale open communities, optical actions to smaller units, less visible action. That's the general trend. But the one exclusion was the first weekend after the war started, when the referendum came about, and to do different assessments, a big number of people for modern Belarus in the modern situation, not comparable with what was in 2020, but for this situation, it was a lot. And for many, it was a shock that so many people came to the protest. The further protest activity in Belarus basically was in guerrilla format. The main direction of this format is anti-war movements, solidarity with Ukraine, and support for the refugees. So I would separately say that these hardened activists, they dealt all kinds of assistance to the refugees, not only comparable to what Belarus state used to do, but much more. But in 2 or 3 weeks, the authorities did everything to push the spontaneous activist groups out of this and the remainders of civil society to concentrate on the declarative all the Belarusian Red Cross. It's fully controlled by the government. So direct support of Ukraine were added. So in Belarus, it's considered a crime that threaten huge prison times. Not only prison time, but people were shot at. So there are two main directions: full direct support, collection of information about military activity. Main aggregator was Belaruskaya Akademia. As of May, more than 12,000 people have sent more than 40,000 messages. I think it's a big danger that people who do this pose to themselves. Another aspect is the railway war, cyber war on one hand. On the other hand is the offline direct destruction of the equipment on the railroad. So the authorities responded very quickly, very ruthlessly. Inspections, repressions in the railway. KGB joined in. About 100 people were detained. The enforcers even had to install the militarized posts and shoot people. But the result still has been achieved. Russian railway has banned for some time to move their military echelons in Belarus in nighttime. They stopped marking the cargo, danger or no danger. And there is a result. By March 19th, there is no more rail communication between Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. And Alexei Vesnitsyn has thanked the Belarus partisans or guerrilla warriors for this. Now, all the formats of protest and anti-war activity were also supported by Belarus citizens abroad. And in this area, there are three main directions. First, complex assistance to those who leave Ukraine. No difference. They are Belarus people or Ukrainian Belarus people. The second direction, information resource support of those who remain in Ukraine, especially those who participate in the war, the medics and the military. And of course, the main focus is on the military, those who are in the territorial defense and the armed forces, as Kalinovsky. One more important direction is battling Belarus phobia. And we see another wave of this phenomenon just over the last 3 or 4 days that is in the info space. And basically, Belarus diaspora remains at the previous task, spreading objective information about what's happening in the world and in Belarus itself, supporting compatriots who stay in the country, helping the refugees from the regime, and internal diaspora self-organization, lobbyism, all kinds of events, actions, measures against the repressive regime. The regime, of course, is trying to respond on that ruthlessly, brutally. What is different between what started happening with the start of the war? The authorities are cleansing the remainders of active, more or less, civil society. We can see it in the media. The trade unions can see it. The professional groups feel it, the lawyers, the medics. The main specifics of this current stage from the procedural point of view, I would say two specific points here. Shifting of repression to self-organizing structures. And it shows that in extremist meetings, the meetings that are deemed extremist, the majority of them are remaining alive in self-organizing societies. The second thing, the second specifics, is strengthening or stressing the preventive character of repressions, where the authorities do not respond to clear danger, but they try to preempt who this threat may come from, and they repress them. A number of voters, observers, and different other lists of people who are not to be trusted. So another stress that we see quite a lot is repression by national and cultural indicators. Bans on exhibitions, shows, shutting down publishing houses, shops, sanctions against Belarus language books. This year, all these books were on Belarus language and were about Euro-Russian context. Lithuanian, Polish schools were banned to teach in their languages and only use Russian language. And to resume, because of the repressions in the previous periods, institutional structures of civil society in the country is basically destroyed. Repressions have reoriented to any self-organizing potential and started to be preventive. A new wave of protests from the start of the war has emerged, guerrilla war and direct help to Ukraine. Belarus people abroad also helping refugees supporting Ukrainian troops. Another direction that we need to strengthen, as we've seen from the recent days, is battling the Belarus phobia. Thank you, that wraps my intervention. Thank you, Gennady. Dear speakers, so we have questions now. First, let me say the questions we've got in the chat, and then I'll tell you the questions that were left by participants as they registered. So, first question comes to Lev Lvovskiy. What's happening with the public companies sector? Are there any changes of the policy towards non-financial public sector ever since the start of the war? From Peter Kosarzewski, this question comes. I'd say we don't see part of the data. It's redacted from the public data, but no change in attitude has happened. Many public companies were sanctioned, and it's becoming more difficult because many of them are important for their mono cities. When the salary falls onto them, or the salary is dropping, when the revenue is dropping, the problems start in the entire city, and these problems are much bigger than on average in the economy. If there was a factory in Minsk starts laying still, people can still find some job, maybe a little worse, but not so much. But in the mono city, like Belaruskaya, the potassium company, you cannot find any other job or alternative. And that's why the recession is much higher in this mono city. The authorities have once again started printing money, not so much yet as it used to be in the history of Belarus before. What's going to happen? Most probably, the authorities are aware of this, so they will redirect free money, free funds to support some employment on these companies. Half of the foreign political apparatus of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is now working on finding buyers for these sanctioned goods, and most difficult is to find transport routes. Like with the potassium itself, the buyers are there, but the problem is that Belarus doesn't have a land connection to India and Brazil. So there are some attempts to rescue them, but so far unsuccessfully. We see more of a redistribution of resources to pay salaries. In some cities, money is printed or banking emission. There is a pressure on banks so that banks write off part of the debt for these companies. They're looking for new exports, but out of what we hear, it's still not successful. If earlier they used to say that for the Russian Belarus terminal, they need a year, then 6 months, and the recent declaration of Lukashenko that in 2 years only, Belarus will have its own terminal. They've been saying that St. Petersburg is ready to take our cargo, but at the same time, cargo is not going there. So, dear speakers, do you have any more comments? Please. If not, then let me ask this next question. Peter Tomaszek is asking from Slovak Embassy in Minsk. Peter said, please tell us, what about $1.5 billion promised by Russia to replace imports? Is it real money? Or it's just the debt of Belarus, the debt that Belarus forgave? And is there information about 15 projects and programs to replace imports that Lukashenko mentioned?
К сожалению, тут очень много всего, чего мы все еще не знаем.
There's still a lot that we don't know. We don't know in what shape or form these 1.5 billion come in. Most probably it's going to be bound loans that will be spent to invest into import replacement industries. Which 15 projects there will be, we don't know. We see some declarations like microelectronics. If it's going to be microelectronics for Russia, it means a serious technological downgrade. Because microelectronics in Belarus that is still there and can be in the nearest future is a very old level. They hopelessly are behind. And we've heard that it can be lumber and lumber felling techniques. So it's a niche industry. And 1.5 billion, it's small money for investment program. So if we think about the serious imports replacement, this amount even more is needed to modernize oil refineries so that they start producing oil products, oil and chemical products that they need in Russia. So this small money will not be seen. They will be quickly spent on investment, but that's better than nothing. Thank you, Kateryna. Dear speakers, maybe you wanted to add something? I would add to this answer that suddenly the relations with Russia has also changed after the start of the war. If earlier there were some agreements with Russia and they existed in reality, ever since the start of the war, we've seen that relations with Russia are within this trend. Concealment of information, and some bravado news. Orchenko has met several colleagues from Russia, and the Belarusian side, their messages were much more positive than the small comments from Russian counterparts. They said several times that Russia has agreed to protract payment of debts for 5 to 7 years, but the Russians, when they commented on this, they say it's just 1 year, not 7 years. And they announced some attractive deal on gas, but again, when the Russians started commenting that, they haven't commented, and we don't know what gas deal eventually there was. Same things with different money promises. Lukashenko's naming different sums of money, but the Russian counterparts never proven. Thank you, Gleb. Next question from Olga Bikovskaya to all the speakers. Have you seen in your sectors how the trend is going to continue in the nearest future? How critical is what has happened from the start of the war? Who could comment? Artyom, please. Hope you can see me or hear me. So, unfortunately, in our volatile time, it's basically impossible to do. It's easier a little bit for me regarding the internal political situation, because the trends that I've seen and more intense repressions as a response to mobilization, more pro-authorities activists, involvement to pressure the opponents, some institutionalization of the second echelon group of the opposition. I think we can think that they are going to continue. We see that in June, because June, July, and August will be in the next report. It's a big mystery what's going to be with the mobilization that Gennady and me both mentioned. Political mobilization, society mobilization, because it directly depends on those events that are now called triggers. Anyway, you cannot predict when they appear. This radical change of war, where Belarus is more actively engaged in it, is going to cause waves in all of these thematic topical blocks, and to mine as well. Most probably, it will cause the new wave of mass mobilization, civilian mobilization. Sociologists will also see these changes in the short trends that they've seen from the start of the war. But I'm going to give the floor to colleagues. De-sovereignization of Belarus will continue. Some reconnections with the Western partners, as from the start of the presentation. There were some attempts like that through high-ranking diplomats to offer to Western partners some deals, removal of part of the sanctions. That's going to continue. There are some things, even with the control of a situation, there's crisis, there's famine looming on the horizon, and it can lead to other crises. So they're going to manipulate these things and to lessen the economic pressure from other countries. Of course, economically, we still depend on Russia, and that will have an impact on foreign policy and bilateral relations with Russia. So Russia will have even more tools of influence on Alexander Lukashenko, depending what is going to happen in Ukraine. We don't need to guess them, but depending on the dynamics of the war, Lukashenko's foreign policy will change. And as Philipp said in his presentation, this attempt to play a peacemaker, well, that gives the Lukashenko some dividends. How the pressure of Russia will be exercised, that will be reflected inside Belarus. And we'll see how Lukashenko will try to exit it with minimal losses. We'll see how the conflict develops and this Russian offensive in Ukraine. I can say that economically, this war for Russia against Ukraine is either the most important event in the modern independent Belarus history or one of the most important. We have not yet reached the bottom of the crisis, but even now, the monthly numbers show a certain trend. There are different forecasts to how GDP of Belarus will go down. And basically all these predictions say that in the nearest 2 years, the GDP will be down by 10%. And after that, the potential growth of Belarus economy will also be decreased, most probably down to 0.5% per year. What it means for Belarus? Usually we were growing 1% per year. Now we're thrown back with 10 years back. And then we have such a speed of growth will never catch up with the neighbor countries, Ukraine, Poland, etc. So in a relative sense, we will continue to be poorer. That means outflow of talent, of capital, etc. So the effects here are much stronger than even the political crisis of 2020. Thank you, Lev. Thank you, colleagues. And now we have a series of questions to Philipp Bikanau. But if you have comments, other comments, please also say them. So the question from Alexander Boguslawska from Deutsche Welle. Philipp, increased support of the authorities by 10% looks very strange and unexpected, just like the arguments about war, considering that Lukashenko can enter at any moment. Please comment, what are your results, how they were received? Are there any more reasons to increase the support of the authorities? Thank you for the question. It's a very interesting topic. Maybe I'll write a separate text about it. It's an important survey for Belarus. Can we really trust survey in Belarus? And as researchers, when we saw the results of the 10% change dynamic, the whole team started asking questions, can we trust this? Is it not because of fear or something else? That's why gradually we tried to eliminate hypotheses or exogenic external things that could somehow impact this sample. And we also tried to compare with what other researchers do, not only our team, but also Chatham House team, Artyom Shraibman is doing it. What specifically we did? as Yuri Hrust asked, we basically used 3 data sets. The first was collected in October 2021. So all of them are in online panels. As Artyom said, this is online, city, urban audience. They are educated. Post-stratification was applied in all these samples, which was broken up by gender, the size of residential area, and education. First, 1,500 people. Next, 1,240 in May. And we've seen some dynamics and decided to check our second survey. And then we showed a second online panel, 500 respondents, where in the shortened time, there was a survey, a questionnaire. Why am I confident in the data and the facts that they reflect? Because this questionnaire, this shortened questionnaire, is a wider contour, but it repeats the results from the first panel. Dynamic of big groups. What was it different from the dynamic of small groups? And it also was different in the number of people who did not go through interview completely. It was much lower on the second questionnaire. So we started looking into it. Turns out there are no sharp questions that would be taken as sharp as well. Good example, how fear factor impacts. Index of authority, trust to Alexander Lukashenko and the government. So this is a very sensitive question, and it is prone to fear, because the dynamic is much higher than this 10% growth or 10% growth of these total segments. So people were scared to speak openly, and so we see what is explained by fear factor, what is not explained. And so the clusterizing survey is not explained by the fear factor. Otherwise, online panels where fear factor was empirically less, we would have seen different numbers. But we see what we see. What reasons can there be other than what we described? So basically, I don't know why. I don't think it's not so credible, because we remember 2014, 2015, when Lukashenko basically enjoyed consensuality of his role as a president, but only in 2014 and 15, he had no consolidated big society segment that would unite his opposition, who will never believe him anymore, whatever he does. Now there is still this group. So now, as I talk about the flag effect, I'm talking about neutral groups. Polar groups, they are there, but other groups won't stay in there, even if the nuclear war starts. So the effect is reproduced, but very limited and very temporary and very shallow, because if suddenly Lukashenko drags Belarus in this war, the support will fall. Because people, as they look at the results of other surveys, we know that a war is something that people fear strongly. Based on Chatham House, there's about 30% of people who basically are on the Russian side in this war. The percentage of people who want Belarus to enter the war on the Russian side is from 3 to 6%. Even those who believe more or less that Russia is doing something good, still they don't want Belarus to enter it, because they see catastrophic consequences for themselves, for their country, etc. And that's why this is the sentiment which people less involved were depolitized. They did not monitor political conflict in Belarus. They were not part of it. And most probably, we don't see it directly, but I can assume it is so. They receive information not from the sources that anti-Lukashenko people get. They most probably see official Belarus media or non-governmental Russian or governmental Russian. And so these non-governmental Russian, they never speak about Belarus at all. They only talk about conflict in Ukraine. So considering that these are people who believe a Ukrainian media or war analytics, they understand that Belarus can suddenly enter the war at any moment. But the messages that Lukashenko sends into internal audience, domestic audience, they're different. They are about peace, that we have to stop this, we have to start agreeing, we have to stop. I want to come to the tractor, but they don't want and they force me on a tank. And that explains to me what the dynamic is all about. I can even refer to my colleague whom I talked privately, he said that something similar is visible in his surveys as well, although the methodologies are different, but he also has that something similar. This effect from 2014-15. I hope that I've answered your question. I could add a couple of words here. Sure, Artyom Shraibman, then. Look, you know, if you look at the big trends, one of the most important trends of 2021 was expanding neutrality camp. These polar groups, protesters and pro-government, they've shrunk. The neutrals were increasing because people were fatigued, disillusioned, etc., etc. It's been discussed. Then the war came. People have to start taking decisions. What's the situation people are in? Alternative information is burnt out, and it is a crime to use it. That's why people still read, but not everybody. So the core of the protest remains the same. And it can be seen in different surveys. But it hits the neutrals when it's about domination of Russian content on one hand, and as Philipp said, that propaganda, not all of it, but most of it, has a very balanced position. They say, we don't participate in war, we want peace. And that's the key thing. But the surveys show that the big part of the neutrals, they are honestly believing that Belarus in the Russian-Ukrainian war is not even a party. Whereas Lukashenko is just, he's just throwing hot air. And then this is the flag effect comes in, where there is an external threat, where Lukashenko said, we're doing a great job by avoiding this war. So those neutrals who used to go into neutrality, they start getting politicized, but they are not literate enough to assess the situation. Compared to the year 20, there are much less information now to operate with, to make conclusions from. So basically, it's all explainable. But another thing is that this growth is a trend that can turn into a reverse situation. Something else happens in the war, and these situational pro-governmental people will become its main opposition, because the core of the regime's support, it was the same 15 to 20%. It remains the same percentage. Others are situational things. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I wanted to add the most sensitive question in our report. As for the growth, we found out from this trend that many of our axioms from 2020, like Lukashenko will never be able to get his support. Well, they were not completely wrong, but the war has shaken them somewhat. And so we've seen quite a serious and prominent, even plasticity of public opinion, especially the part that we call neutrals, what we used to call electoral swamp before 2020. And if we go back to the parallel with 2015-14, we should remember what happened later. After the easy presidential elections, where only 50 people protested, Alexander Lukashenko won the election, no problems. In fact, and based on the independent surveys. And then the economic crisis happened. And that crisis was much less deep than what is going on right now and is approaching. So at the start of the 16th, NSCP was living its latest months, and Lukashenko's rating dropped by 27% in several months. But Belarus did not get into the war back then. So what does it say? It says that these people inside that are very plastic in their political moods, they respond to economic stimuli. And they will respond to what my colleague said about the change of the format of the war and the role of Belarus. So I wouldn't have long-lasting conclusions. I would look into the second report. So please join in after a quarter. We'll see what will change. Right. Thank you, colleagues. I see Yuri Dragoplus is now with us. Yuri, you wanted to say something, right? Yuri, we still cannot see you. Yeah, I just wanted to say my question and just a couple of words maybe as part of the discussion. My answer to Alexander Boguslavsky was asking, I think it's explained easily. If you explain them with the mindset of this centric swamp, one of the motives is simple. Lukashenko is strong and he won. And that's why the swamp, as in many counter-revolutions, are always on the side of the winner. They have no principle, they have no core. So saying that the revolution continues, no, the swamp continues that Lukashenko won. And that's why. That's one thing. And second thing, the basic mechanism of joining around the flag means the country is under threat. And if there's a strong authority, then authority means motherland. Again, it's not me thinking that, it's them, it's their mindset. And this mechanism works as well. Around the threat, yeah. They don't want to go to war, but without Lukashenko, it's going to be even worse, as he said, as Philipp said. But that's the way it is. In the situation of crisis and danger, there should be strong-willed authority. And they showed in 2020 how willful they are. And so, okay, hooray. But they don't want to go to war. That's my explanation. As for my question, Philip, could you say, how do you split those who trust and those who don't trust to Lukashenko? And how this attitude towards war in Ukraine, not regarding whether should Belarus people go to this war, but anti-Russian or pro-Russian in the aspect of war? Thank you, Yuri. I can only assume here. I can only assume because I've never been asked this kind of questions. So there are two indirect parameters here that I will use to answer this question. First of all, we had an experiment in our survey. We will write about it later. It was not part of this main report. It was not completely on the topic. It was not entirely about trends. So we asked two versions of what happened in Bucha. One is Ukrainian, which described actuality of what happened in Bucha, and then the Russian narrative, who said that this was all fakes. And so these two messages for response, and they were asked to assess, is it lies or is it truth? So what we see, that in general, people don't believe anything. They don't believe either. They are not confident. There's a certain, dependent on which segment they are. They are pro authorities, they would rather believe Russian and vice versa, but that's not 100% explanation. People don't understand what's happening in reality. And secondly, if you look at Rigora Stepenio and his study, his survey, there are also, there's a trend that if someone is pro-government, most probably they will be pro-war. And this extent, to what extent are they pro-war? That means, can they justify something like Bucha? Do they know anything that happened in there? And we don't have answers to these questions, or to give a proportion or anything. I would say that most probably Lukashenko, pro-Lukashenko will be pro-war. But out of this data that I know, it's hard to conclude anything substantial. But it can also, not necessarily from our study, there's Chatham House figures. It's very convenient. You can refer to other colleagues. And Chatham House doesn't have any breakdown by segments in supporting the war. But the logic is clear, I believe. Right, Philip and Yuri, thank you very much. Dear speakers, dear listeners, the time for our presentation is almost exhausted. We will wrap now. Just a couple of organizational issues. The full version of the report in Russian and English languages will be published on the website of Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. You will also find the description of our streams on YouTube. There will be a link to both versions, and we will send the survey to all of the participants. You can find it on social network, on Facebook, and Belarus Focus Press Club. So dear speakers, if you have some more comments, please, you have the floor. Artyom, please. Yeah, just a short remark. On behalf of all of us, all the authors, I would like to thank all who came today asking questions for Ebert Foundation, to thank for supporting us, not only supporting the study, but as coordinators in the project. There must be Valeria Klemenko with us, who will be with us from the next presentation. Lera, thank you very much for the support. So thanks a lot. Right, thanks everybody. And see you all next time, somewhere in 3 months. There will be the next presentation. Thank you, and stay safe. Thank you.